Hi, and welcome to the first live broadcast of Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. I'm your host, Melissa B. I'm very delighted to to be here on my own YouTube channel. Thank you for inviting me to myself. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the way that I got started doing this podcast. I was talking to a good friend of mine, Cindy, and we were talking about how it's so important for people to share their stories, that it's something that makes the world seem a lot smaller, because stories are really universal. And we talked about how October is the best month for telling stories and people sharing the sometimes spooky things that have happened to them. And that's one of the topics that I've always really enjoyed. I've always really enjoyed the liminal spaces. And my friend David said that the word liminal is hard to understand what it means. So it's like a place that's in between something. It's in between day and night. It's in between dawn and dusk. Those places that seem like they're changing and a little bit strange and a little bit out of the ordinary. And it's not just places, but it's also states of being, states of mind, states of life, rituals that we have, like weddings and things like that, are also a liminal space. We're in an in-between place. These two people who are getting married they're making this transition from a life that they lived before and then a life that they'll have after. It's the same thing when we attend a funeral or a wake, that the person has passed from their body, but they're not yet passed from our hearts and minds and our recent memory. And always human beings have done things and created celebrations and told stories about these special times because it brings us together. It makes us heal. It shows us that we're not alone. And I find that to be one of the beautiful mysteries of life, these liminal spaces. And I'm very honored to have as my guest tonight Karen Frazer. The episode will speak more about her than I can possibly ever speak to about how wonderful she is, what a good friend she is, how wise she is, the presence that she has, which is, if you ever have the good fortune to meet her in person, such a welcoming person, such a warm person. It's always a better day when you meet Karen. And we worked together at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and I know that she's greatly loved in that community as well. So without further ado, I will offer to you now episode 5, which is about protecting headstones and burial places. Please enjoy. This is a show about authentic, deep connection to the liminal spaces. Join me and my guests as we explore the boundaries between the expected and the unexplained, between the living and the dead, between heaven and earth, between everyday life and the initiation into the unseen realms. Welcome to Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. I'm your host, Melissa B. In this episode,
that's one of the best things about being comfortable in cemeteries and other sacred spaces, just to appreciate them for what they are, enjoy your time there, but don't feel like you need to take anything away from it. Leave pieces there for other people to discover.
If you ever go to Sleepy Hollow, New York, and to the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, there you will find the final resting place of the father of the American ghost story, Washington Irving. If you go to his family plot, you'll notice that his headstone is larger and rounder than the headstones around him. This is not because he wanted to stand out. This is because it's the third version of his headstone. The first two were completely destroyed by souvenir hunters who chipped away at his grave until there was nothing left. For those of us who are tour guides in the cemetery, and for the people who love Washington Irving and appreciate the importance of cemeteries in particular, we hope that this is the third and final version of his headstone. Believe it or not, people often go into a cemetery and believe that they can take things with them. And people also believe that when they go to land, that they can just claim that land. Here to talk about some of these really scintillating topics with us is Karen Frazer. She's a researcher, an amateur historian, a cemetery tour guide, a photographer of cemeteries, and an all-around good auntie. She is the type of person who, everywhere she goes, she makes friends, and her family is just truly the human family. Welcome, Karen. I'm so delighted to have you on my show. Could you please talk a little bit about some of the controversy surrounding grave rubbings?
Grave rubbings are cool. I'm not gonna diss that. Certainly, grave rubbings certainly look cool. If you visit the Historical Society serving Sleepy Hollow in Tarrytown, they do have some very old, like 1900, 1901 grave rubbings of some of the stones in the churchyard. But so many people visited Katrina Van Tassel's gravestone, and so many people did grave rubbings of her stone that her stone is almost completely gone at this point.
If the name Katrina Van Tassel sounds familiar to you, that's because it's from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving.
The red sandstone that her stone is made of course, sandstone has layers to it. So what ends up happening is it just kept peeling, like pieces just kept peeling off because the pressure and the damage of the crayon back and forth across the surface turned it into just these little flakes of artwork that are left. If you visit Katrina's stone at this point, it's mostly concrete. And then they just have the artwork that's left, and the wording that is left stuck to the concrete. It's not the whole stone anymore. And you can see what her stone would have looked like by looking at her husband Petrus's stone, which is right next to it.
It seems so strange to us in this era of litigation that an author would hear a name and like the sound of it so much that he created a character from that name. And that's why Katrina Van Tassel's headstone has been just as vandalized as Washington Irving's has been.
Her husband Petrus and his cousin Cornelius, both of them fought on the American side during the war against the British, and both of them spent, I think, about a year in one of the British prisons in Manhattan. And their wives, Elizabeth and Katrina, had to keep things together in the Tarrytown Sleepy Hollow area, which was a really rough place to be during the Revolutionary War because it was between what the soon-to-be Americans controlled, the soon-to-be U.S. controlled, and the British. So that was a really rough place to be. A lot of raids on the farmhouses, a lot of, the British soldiers would set people's houses on fire or their barns, take their cattle.
Probably slaughter the cattle for food and feed their soldiers with your cattle. And
well, yeah. Well, a lot of times what they would do is they would come up to Westchester County and they would just take the cattle and herd them back down to Manhattan to feed people. So yeah, that's one of the things, like, and it, of course, very common wartime activity of stealing what you need.
And it's a good thing that Petrus's headstone is still standing intact, because we can actually get a better idea of what Katrina's headstone would have looked like before all of this irreversible damage was done to it throughout the centuries.
So it's really terrible that her stone is in such awful shape. And it's just because her name, I mean, it's not even spelled the same, but her name is the same as the story character. That's the reason why, like I said, gravestone rubbings are cool, but don't do them. Take a picture. You can manipulate a picture in your computer. You can make it look like a gravestone rubbing. You can even take the image that you photographed and you can take it to a maker space and you can carve it into a piece of slate if you want to. You can have all kinds of fun with the image that you take. But if you do these rubbings where you take the big piece of newsprint and the side of a crayon or the side of a charcoal and you do these rubbings, the damage that is done to these stones is irreparable. And in a lot of instances, especially for women back from that period and earlier, or even well into the 50s, women didn't own property, didn't own businesses for the most part. So there's not this long paper trail of being able to study a woman's history when you go back to that period. Other than, hey, there's a gravestone and it gives the date of birth and the date of death and maybe a little bit of more information on it. So preserving these stones, I think, is really important.
Yes, it seems that desecrating land, sacred land for burying, and just sacred land and holy places is something that is rife in our culture.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about that earlier, where we talked about how, the sacred lands of indigenous people being taken from them, being turned into something else in order to have just another way of erasing what's important to a different people. Taking sacred things like that, even cemeteries, say people going into cemeteries today, what do I like to say? Like, something that's not, if it's not screwed down, somebody's going to take it. Like Washington Irving being such a popular author when he died, that people would come to the cemetery because they didn't come to take a picture. They didn't have a camera. So they would chip little pieces off of his gravestone to take home as a memento. It's like, I got this. You get enough people doing that, of course, they whittle the stone down to nothing, and the family replaces the stone, and people keep doing it. They just keep chipping pieces off of it and taking pieces with them. But people do that still today when there are discoveries of places where people have either lived or the dead have been buried. If people find something that they consider of value, they will just take it. And these things end up in private collections. These things end up in museums. And it's not right. I mean, I wish that people could just leave things where they see them and not have to take everything. But we've all been raised under this capitalistic assumption that everything belongs to somebody. Like, something can't belong to everybody for some reason, unless it's something that's not ours in the first place, like national parks or national forests. I mean, even if you go back to the destruction of the burying ground for the enslaved people on Phillipsburg Manor, somebody needed to own that property, apparently, so that made it okay for them to just go ahead and bulldoze it, because they didn't think it was important to them. It was important to someone else, but whatever. So they just went ahead and sold it off as if it was not important.
There is now a project in its early stages to create a plaque or some kind of a memorial near the burying ground where the enslaved African people lived and loved and suffered and worked and died.
Yeah.
You know,
well, it's not like we all have ancestors to look up to. I mean, there's certainly there's not good people in lots of different places, and that doesn't mean that we are bad. But it's something that we need to be, I don't know, think about and be aware of, because that is part of our past, and to be honest about it, and to do the work to come out of the other end of that garbage in your past, and to make yourself a better person in the work that you do and the things that you are going to show the most energy towards. Because it's important that we know where we come from, and it's not always the perfect place that we would like to think it is. And there are certainly ancestors who don't deserve the reverence that we might give other ancestors. But to learn from what they did and to stop the cycle of that, I think, is the most important thing. Because we talk about like whitewashing history, and how history is written by the people who write the books, and it's from their perspective, and we miss out on so much that way. That research and being able to go back and look at things and trying to figure out, I mean, even if we do research, we have to make sure that what we're researching is true. There's always been a lot of disinformation. There's always been a lot of whitewashing of historical, elements of things that have happened. I mean,
what we get is the history of the ruling class when we learn about history in school.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, even if you look at like the Italian railroad workers, and how much trouble I had trying to figure out what their names actually were, because nobody cared enough to make sure they were spelling them right.
Karen solved a mystery, y'all. Listen.
It's fun that I was able to stumble on this, actually. For a couple of years, I was a research assistant in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery office, and spending some time with the old ledger books. And I had heard from folks both at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery and from the Historical Society serving Sleepy Hollow Tarrytown, that there had been, during the time of the railroad expansion up the Hudson River from New York City, there had been an explosion during some of the train track construction. And most of the men who were working that job were Italian immigrants. Many of them did not even speak English. A whole flatbed train car exploded, and this all happened in May of 1891. Now, most of the men were part of a group of Italian immigrants who lived in Port Chester. Many of these men did not have family in town. Many of them had family back in Italy, and they were sending money back when they had it to help out their families. So when this explosion happened, and the guy who kept track of all of their work, his notebook had the information in it about all of these guys who they had to wear a brass number plate. That's how they kept track of them on the payroll. They didn't even bother to learn these men's names. They kept track of them by a number. When the explosion happened, most of these men lost their numbers. So they had a hard time figuring out exactly who was dead. There were a lot of newspaper articles written that talked about the explosion and about the death of these men. But the newspapers, as they started figuring out what the names of these men were, I kept coming across different names because they were all spelled wrong. that's just another way of showing that, oh, it's not as important. You don't have to do that all correctly, blah, blah, blah. I was able to find where they were buried in the cemetery by accident. I was working in one of the ledger books, and it was alphabetical by last name, and I was looking through the letter U in the ledger book because I was just curious about like unknown burials, people who were buried that didn't have a name attached to them. And I came across this last name that started with a U that, to me, a completely uneducated person when it comes to Italian, the name looked Italian. So I was like, huh. So I saw where this burial was, this person's burial, and I looked on the map where they were. And then it was like, well, that's in the single grave section. So there's a part of the old part of the cemetery where it's all individual graves. There's no family plots in that area. So I looked at that spot, and I was like, well, let me see who else is in that row. And I started to look at the names of the other people who were buried close to this person. And it was a bunch of Italian names. And it was a bunch of graves that were all bought by the railroad. And all of these people died on the same day. I'm like, oh my God, I found it.
Wow.
I was just so excited because, talking to like Sleepy Hollow historians, they're like, well, we know that they're buried here. We just don't know where. And I was able to find it, and I was over the moon. I was like, here they are. So I had these newspaper articles, and I had the handwritten old ledger book from the cemetery. And I still had a hard time figuring out who was who because everybody spelled the names different. Like they would spell them phonetically or whatever.
Right.
And out of all of these graves lined up next to each other, only one of them has a stone. So that way I could point out, like, okay, here's this guy, but then there's like two more over here and the rest of them are this way. So they're all buried in the same row together.
Karen is a photographer of cemeteries, and she gave me a stack of photographs to look through in order to choose some visual images for this episode. And the one that I chose is called Silent. But Karen has broken the silence and given these men back their identity. She has become their voice. It reminds me a lot of what you had said in the past, that you really die twice.
You die twice. That's a belief, and I'm not sure exactly how many different, belief systems, that we die once when our body dies. We die when we stop breathing, when our heart stops beating. We die again the last time someone thinks of us or says our name. And that was one of the best things about being a tour guide in the Old Dutch Burying Grounds and in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, was being able to keep these characters alive, keep these people alive, keep these little pieces of history alive by, telling about them. Even simple stuff like one of my favorite stones that when I was working in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, I would always walk past Little Willie. There's a few Little Willies in the cemetery, and Willie was a name that was popular for a while. And if it was a little kid that passed away, beautiful little stones with a lamb on top, and Little Willie, I would stop there if I needed to, like, pad the time or try not to bump up against another tour guide. I'd stop and talk about Little Willie and talk about, when children died, this was a common art motif for a while, doing this lamb on top of the stone. And, you know, this is back when, you know, we didn't have vaccines and we didn't have penicillin and we didn't have all these things that keep people alive now. And if you think about dying twice, when you're little like that, not very many people know you. So there's not very many people to carry on the knowledge of your existence. And so there's not people to be around to say your name again. So that was my way of keeping little Willie alive, was to, you know, at least say his name. I didn't know anything else about him. But I had his name and his dates, and that was it. So that was a way of pointing that sort of thing out to people, was to stop and talk about little Willie. And now I've become obsessed with the name Willie, and every time I see a Willie in a churchyard or a cemetery, I have to take a picture.
Thanks, Karen, so much for your time. It's really been an amazing, illuminating, exciting conversation. What words would you leave us with?
The more you learn, the more you need to ask questions. And the further into it, like everybody talks about going into the rabbit hole of doing genealogy, and how that's just like the focus of, like, everybody's got that auntie in their family that's doing all of that and has all of the information for everybody, because that's what she's been putting all of her energy into for like the last 20 years. And I think that my job as an auntie, I think it's very important, because I did not have kids myself, but to set myself as a role model of doing things differently. Like, I think that's part of my road to becoming a good crone, is being a good auntie, and being able to point out, it's like, well, you don't have to do it this way just because that's the way your family's always done it. You can do it this way instead. And yeah, just keep asking questions, because there's always an answer out there. Sometimes it's just going to take a really long time to find it.
Is there anybody cooler than Karen? I don't know. That being said, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. I hope to see you next time for more exciting content by really cool people. As always, the music in this episode was written and performed by another really cool person, Lee Chernowitz, who gives every episode such style and class. Thank you so much. See you next time.